Transition Radio TV, brought to you by thebreastformstore.com. They have everything you could possibly need for cross-dressing and transgender needs. Visit the website at www.thebreastformstore.com and tell them Transition Radio sent you.
The following ingredients include a look behind the scenes. Cook uncovered until hot. Add grooves to taste.
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Once upon a time, there was a little girl.
The accident was over a year ago. A second woman has been elected president. A 12th planet has been named in the solar system. The last wild polar bear has died. I slept through it all. I was here for my waking. He called it a beginning. He said it was good. I think he may have thought that anything I did was good.
Welcome to Transition Radio. Your host, Mark Angelo Cummings. And good evening and welcome to Transition Radio TV, live from the land of enchantment, Silver City, New Mexico. I love that intro. It took a long time to put everything together, and I especially love the time is now, time for transmission. There's a lot of hidden messages in that intro, and those of you who are awake and aware, I'm sure, get the message that I was trying to convey. Well, I want to take my time, or I want to take this time, not my time, but this time, to thank my new sponsor, Spunk Lube. Spunk Lube is an award-winning personal lubricant that's glycerin-free, non-staining, 100% toy-safe sex toys with all materials. And it's fun to use. Available in Spunk Lube Hybrid, Spunk Lube Pink, and Spunk Lube Pure Silicone, which is my favorite, by the way. Visit their website at www.spunklube.com and give the code TR and receive a 10% discount. That's right, 10% discount. And that nowadays, every penny counts. Well, tonight we have Cianán Russell, who is a lapsed PhD chemist, writer, public speaker, trainer, activist, and assessment expert whose passion and activism are trans-masculine representation in global trans activism and development of the public concept of trans folks as complete people with lives, identities, and desires beyond simply being trans. As a gay trans man, his personal interest includes expanding the visibility of the variety of trans folks, prevention and treatment of sexual violence and rape amongst trans survivors, and HIV/AIDS-related services for gay and queer trans men. Cianán writes a blog at transscienceinside.blogspot.com and lives in Bangkok with his partner.
So the discrimination within the healthcare setting is in, lots of different layers.
Transition-related healthcare for trans men is essentially non-existent.
When you talk about being a transgender to go to government hospital, of course we are reluctant to go. I think it's because of the judgmental attitude of the staff of the hospital.
As soon as you walk into that lab, someone who's your neighbor or someone who knows you will just turn around and say, I wonder what he's up to.
We're at risk for all the same sorts of gynecological problems that cis women are, but typically don't receive continuing care.
Many times that transgender women have to go to the private clinic, in which it's very expensive. Trans people are using hormone and all the things without any prescription, going to the pharmacy and taking the birth control pills as a hormone.
You know, if you're really sick and you want to get warded, you'll be put in the female ward, which is a terrible thing because nobody wants to see my face in the female ward.
I would like to see that transgender can change title of the name.
I wish that the privacy can be kept for the transgender who don't want to disclose it, and respect to those who come out, just like respecting like any other persons.
Transgender want to learn and want to educate themselves.
I think it's very important not to forget that we are humans and that we need the same kind of things as other people.
The commitment, the political commitment has to come up from the respective country, and the country should start owning the transgender community as their own citizen with constitutional rights, human rights, and basic rights of human being as they are.
To train the doctor and sensitize them about the transgender issues.
For health providers to increase their knowledge in transgender issues.
If we have female appearance, then put us in female ward.
Healthcare services must be accessible and affordable for every single transgender.
I hope in the future that every transgender citizen is conscious to their well-being and exercise their right to health.
I believe that this is the beginning, and I am looking forward that we will have a very encouraging and supportive environment for transgender people.
My hope for the future of trans people is that we eventually get to be treated like people.
What we are advocating for is equal right, not special right.
Trans rights are human rights.
And now welcome to the show, Cianán Russell. How you doing?
Thanks very much for having me, Mark. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I seem to have this great connection in Thailand because you're around like the 5th Thailand interview that we've had. So it's become home without me actually having been there. That was a very touching video, and it touched upon a lot of the same problems that we have here in the States and I'm sure around the world. Tell us a little bit about the organization on that video we just watched.
So it's important first to recognize that the video is about Asia and the particular problems that take place in Asia and Pacific for trans folks. The infrastructure is really quite different than it is in the West, both in terms of the way people access medical care and the ways that jobs and education work, etc. So a lot of the quotes that are in that may not be true for your Western viewers, but certainly are in other parts of the world. The organization that put the video together is UNAIDS, and they worked in collaboration with the Asia Pacific Transgender Network, which was who I was involved with at the time, which is a sort of regional affiliation of a bunch of organizations doing local work in Asia and the Pacific on trans rights issues. And they bring all of those organizations together to try to do regional level and international work in this part of the world.
Interesting. And how did you come across them, or did they come to you, or was it something based on what you're working on as an activist?
You know the relatively popular phrase that all trans men know each other? It sort of came around that way. I met a trans guy who lives in Bangkok. There was a conference coming through. I got invited to the conference because I knew random trans guy who knew random other trans guy, et cetera, and I got hooked up with this organization. I bring a lot of activism experience from my up and coming years. I've been working as an activist for probably around 15 years, and so I was hoping to bring some of that experience to the table for this organization and some of the others I've been working with in Asia.
Interesting. Your accent, I'm trying to put it together. Are you from the Netherlands or Europe somewhere?
No, actually I'm an American. I grew up in the Midwest and went to college in Iowa, grad school in Indiana, lived in Atlanta for a while, and now I live in Thailand. So I'm an American.
Strange. I wonder why, because you have this like almost British, but not quite type of accent to your, maybe it's just
I'm not really sure what that is. One thing that I know happens is the longer you live outside of the place you're from, the more you sort of pick up bits and pieces of other people's accents. And I'm also used to speaking a lot of English to people who do not speak English as a first language. So that's probably part of it as well.
It's so true when you mention about, you know, one trans guy and you kind of know them all. And I guess because, I don't know, maybe Facebook has made it to the point where we kind of all know each other, maybe not personally, but we've heard of one another in a sense, or we've seen one another in many posts on Facebook. And it's amazing how it's almost like connections that we tend to make. It's very interesting. You wrote this blog entry titled "A Gay Trans Man Navigating Rape Culture." As trans myself, the thought of being raped when I was in my female body was very prominent. Yet I had not really thought about being raped now as a trans guy. Can you give us a glimpse to this entry for those who have not read it yet?
Sure. So about a little over a year ago now, I was raped by a friend. And I think the thing that I was trying to get at in the post, and that is important for me, is about how the transition experience changed the way I have interacted with rape as a concept, and sort of moving from what you were talking about, participating in society as female, and how I was taught to experience rape and rape culture, and how then moving into being perceived as male changed my role. I went from being the person walking down the street who was afraid of someone else walking down the street to being the person being feared, and having to see that experience from both sides. And now, having moved into gay male space predominantly, being sort of back in a position of potentially being assaulted or being a victim has changed the way that, again, that I interact with the concept. And it obviously became significantly more personal for me when I was assaulted myself than it was before. It was something that was able to be academic and intellectual, and it no longer really is. I think the point I'd like to try to get to today in our conversation is about the way that we support trans folks who've experienced sexual assault, because our experience is much more complicated than it is for cis folks. When non-trans folks are sexually assaulted, there's absolutely a violation experience and a sort of sense of self, etc. All of these things are at risk. And with trans folks, the additional layer of risking our sexual and gender identities as a part of the experiences makes it much more complex. I really don't find that I can't use resources designed for non-trans people in trying to deal with my emotional work post-sexual assault. That I really need to talk to other trans folks who've gone through something similar, because for me, it really challenged my gender identity and the way that I think about my body, and that after being in transition for 13 years, having to go through that process again was really quite difficult, because it was like sort of having the wind knocked out of your emotional sails, if you will.
Wow. And, you know, like, I've been very lucky. I've never really come across that. I have not really been in the gay culture that long. When I first transitioned, I was married to a genetic female. Then I had a 2-year relationship with a trans female, and now I'm very interested in gay men. So reading your blog has really put a lot of, I don't want to say fear, but, you know, I'm more aware now that something of that nature could happen. And, you know, maybe that's one of the reasons I decided, you know, I better like really work out hard, bulk up, and be able to defend myself in the case that something near that nature takes place. When you tell somebody, no, I don't want to do this, that they respect the fact that you say no. So
there's a couple things I want to say to that. First off, and this is a bit of an aside, but I'm not a small guy. I'm not physically diminutive, and I think it's important to recognize that sexual assault can happen to anyone. It's not about necessarily one's ability to fight someone else off. It's because it's not really usually about physical prowess so much as it is about an execution of power. And for me, it wasn't an issue of not being able to physically fight the guy off. It was an issue of him exerting a particular type of power and my not being able to get out of a situation safely. So I don't want us to go down a road where it sounds like if you're big enough, you can prevent this from happening to you. That said, I also don't think that it's useful to think of rape as something we need to carry around as a constant fear. I think it's just something we need to be talking about and making space for, both in terms of prevention within trans male spaces and support for those of us dealing with the after effects of a sexual assault. Since I came out, again, I guess, as a rape survivor, I've had a couple of dozen, at least, trans men contact me saying they were also a survivor. I've made a small secret group on Facebook that I'm happy to invite folks into to participate in conversation, really just because everyone I've talked to didn't know any other trans men that have experienced sexual violence. And we keep it so heavily under wraps, I think, in particular with trans men, because it violates a concept of our masculinity. If we are violable in our bodies, then our masculinity is also violable. And that makes transitional identity, puts it at risk, I guess.
Right. And I didn't mean any type of disrespect, but even when females are taught self-defense to be able to deal with a predator of some sort, I mean, one of the things that I've always come to mind, not even rape, but if you go to a bar and you get some drunken dude who wants to pick a fight with you, it's just one of those things, because we weren't socialized as men, and men's strength versus our strength is totally different. So right. It's like one of those things in the back of our mind, okay, I've got to be prepared to be able to defend myself or defend the woman I'm with or the person I'm with. And these are things that we're not taught. It's like, here, have hormones and have your surgeries. No one really socializes us. We're not taught certain things. So I meant no disrespect by saying, I know you're not a small guy, by all means. Sometimes the structure is not, it's knowing how to fight, how to defend, how to get out of a situation and things of that nature. And it's scary. It's a scary thought to even remotely that you're trusting somebody to go out with, and then they're going to take advantage of you.
Right. And I think that I wasn't taking it personally in that regard. What I think is important, though, is in discussions of rape and sexual assault, to make clear whose fault it actually is. The experience that I had absolutely nothing to do with my physical prowess. I wouldn't have been able to stop it had I been bigger or more well-trained in personal safety, etc. The man that assaulted me wanted to assault me and used his power in a way that made that possible for him. It's entirely his fault. It's not mine. And that's not me speaking from an emotional place. That's about how we conceptualize rape and sexual assault and bodily integrity as a culture. There's a lot of victim blaming that gets thrown around, and that only further exacerbates the power differential between the perpetrator and the victim or survivor. If someone wants to take something from you, they're going to figure out how to take it, if that's the kind of power dynamic that they want in place. And so I just think it's important to talk about rape and sexual assault in a way that puts the blame on the right people.
Oh, definitely. It's very scary to think that there are people out there who we might become target to. They know we're trans and they get it in their head like, I want to mess with this person just because they don't like what we did. And it's scary. And that's not really something that I've even thought about. And as open as I am, I mean, everybody knows that I'm trans. God only knows if you get some idiot who just wants to be take revenge on me and try to hurt me and then prove to me, look, you're not a man. I'm going to do this to you. You know,
Right,
that kind of
right.
thing. Which is,
And there's also this piece with gay trans men in particular, where because cis gay men amongst themselves are really sort of competitive, and there's a really particular dynamic among non-trans gay men. It seems like lots of trans men get mentally into a place where we are apologizing for our identities and our experience. And in doing so, we often make acquiescences in our relationships, be they emotional or sexual, with other gay men that we wouldn't otherwise be comfortable making. Gay trans men are more likely to participate in unsafe sex when a cis partner asks them to, because we feel like they're making an exception to be with us, or like they're giving up something really important to them to be sexual with us. And the same thing is true with experiences of sexual assault and rape. People are gay trans men are less likely to report, and also less likely to consider something that is in fact a sexual assault, because we've conditioned ourselves to think of ourselves as lesser and not good enough for the non-trans gay men that we might want to interact with. And I think that mentality is really dangerous and allows us to sort of stay in a potential victim role that I'd like to see us try to move past.
Or not even reported, which is pretty scary, because then people get away with it, which is, yeah. There's another entry, when a compliment is not, and I guess one of your blog entries, I was born in just the right body. I was born in this body because I needed this path to become a person I could be proud to be. Can you explain to our viewers what that meant?
Yeah, I guess that I personally have a really big problem with all of the born in the wrong body narratives, because I think it oversimplifies our experience, and for many of us isn't actually true. For me, had I been born with a cis male body and assigned male at birth, I really frankly think I would not be a very nice person. Having gone through transition, having been socialized as female as a child, and being able to have seen the world through particular oppression lenses allows me empathy that I don't think I would have necessarily had given the privilege that I experience in my life. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that I got to see oppression in a variety of ways throughout my life, because it's made me into someone who has empathy and compassion. And I don't always exercise it to the best of my ability, but I have the capacity for it, and I'm not entirely certain I would have had that same capacity had I not been assigned female at birth.
I feel the same way. I am very proud of who I used to be, and I know a lot of our trans brothers and sisters just want to eradicate their past and totally forget about it. I don't feel that way. Every chance I get, I educate people. I will show the picture of me as a female. I'm very proud of being trans. I mean, that's... You know, it's like you said, if I would have been born in a male body, I probably would be the biggest asshole in the world, you know, because right. Not to say that all men are assholes, but I think because of living as a female for 38 years, I could empathize, understand things a little bit better. And in my opinion, we're here to learn how to balance both our yin and our yang. That's the two male and female energy, the duality that we as humans possess. And I think it would be the greatest gift if everybody in the world would get to experience that first half of their life as one gender and the second half of their life in the other gender. You know, it's...
I absolutely agree with you about it being a gift. Though there are certainly times where I go through personal pity parties. At the end of the day, I definitely feel like I got this special opportunity having trans experience in my life, because I get to move through the world with a really special book of knowledge. I get to live as a man having understood and lived as a woman, and I think that is just so cool. And I'm grateful for it. I certainly haven't been grateful every moment, but but in the larger scheme of things, I'm grateful for having gotten to experience it and continuing to experience it. And that sort of hits on one of the things you were saying. I am not a person who thinks about transition as a thing that ends. I've been doing this since 2001, and it doesn't end. You don't stop thinking about or interrogating gender unless you want to, and some people do, but I value that part of my life. I value getting to think about it in these really unique ways, and I don't expect that to be something that ends. So I don't use the phrase like post-transition. I like to think of myself as having been in transition for X number of years, because it's something that I hope, frankly, I get to be thinking about and talking about for the rest of my life.
Yeah, it's an evolution. We're evolving as a species, and I truly believe it. I mentioned this years ago that there's going to be a major epidemic, and I hate using that word, but when I came out back in 2003 and I was doing the talk show circuit, I mentioned that to one of the hosts, and he looked at me like I was from another planet. And sure enough, it was just like all of a sudden, boom. I mean, you go to YouTube and you see all these videos, and you see all these kids at 3 or 4 years old telling their parents the gender that they feel as. And it's almost like the universe is speaking. It's something is happening, and it's bigger than our brains could probably, even fathom or consider. But I think it's great. I mean, I really do. If I had to do this all over again, I would.
I agree. I feel the same way about it. I would not. I would certainly change things, but I would not transition. That I wouldn't have. I think there are mental games that I've played with other trans people before. If you could go back and be born in the other body, would you? Those kinds of games. And for me, the answer is no. I wouldn't be this person had I not been socialized the way that I was. And this person is a person that I am working on being proud to be, and that's my path. That's what made me who I am.
It's bigger than materialistic. It's very spiritual in nature, and a lot of people may not get that, and that's okay. We're all in different levels, but I can't even put words. I mean, it's the universe is speaking. That's pretty much the way that I could say it. You identify as a gay trans man. I know for many of us who identify as such, it has been a tough road. How has it been for you?
From really just an identity perspective, it's one of those things that I think it catches a lot of trans men off guard. For me, I dated women up until I started to transition, and for about 1.5 years afterwards. And then it sort of light bulbed into my brain that I could date men, and that maybe it would be different than it would have been before transition. And so I gave it a shot, and it was like, oh, wow, this is a whole new way for me to interact with people. But entrenched in that was having to figure out how to be a gay man, and how to interact with non-trans men and non-trans men's bodies, and also how to keep from having those interactions negatively impact my sense of self, because I will never have those bodies, and they're the bodies that the parts of my trans brain want, and having to figure out how to keep from going too far in a self-defeating sort of mental cycle. I think a couple of things are worth mentioning when talking about gay trans men. One of them is we have an extraordinary amount of invisibility because trans men can often go stealth relatively easily once on testosterone for a certain period of time. It's a strong hormone and has pretty strong effects for most people. We just don't have the kinds of visibility in general, and within gay male spaces, there's a lot of discussion of trans folks, but it's typically focused on drag queens and trans feminine people, so and trans women. So we sort of get left out of that conversation. Further, because gay male space is almost entirely non-trans men. There is a lot of vaginophobia and sort of aversion, active aversion to the female body that gets put on trans men directly and indirectly, because we hear those messages. We hear vaginas are bad, vaginas are gross, and many of us don't have lower surgery, so we still have something that could be called a vagina. And so we're being told indirectly by our friend group that our bodies are disgusting, and we're already experiencing that internally. So having our friend group also reinforce that message creates for some complicated identity issues. I'd like, long term, to see gay men challenge the concept of what it is to be men in a more active way. Gay identity in the first place challenges what it is to be men, and so the capacity for that challenge is there. It just needs to be taken to the next level. What is, does the penis make the man, essentially? And I think that most people would say no, not really, but that focus is still really hyper present in gay male space. Outside of a handful of small pockets in the world, it seems like trans men are just entirely unconsidered in gay male contexts, and that's a conversation that I feel like I guess I challenge the non-trans men who might hear this interview to push on, because it's their responsibility. I can only say so much as a trans man myself, but non-trans gay men who are trans positive have an opportunity to make some real change in their friend spaces by challenging sexism and misogyny when they see it.
Definitely, and it is a challenge. I mean, I'm finding myself having difficulty finding a partner, and like myself, many other trans guys who are attracted to gay men or men in general, we have that challenge, because again, it's like, okay, well, did you get your surgery? No, and so it's like right away, it's a put off. They could be all into me. When the moment I say I'm trans, you can see the fear in their eyes, and they're like, you mean you have one of the, yeah, but I've got, I try to explain to them, yeah, I've got the vagina, but I also have the other, which is, okay, infantile looking and everything else, but it's still there and it still reacts. And, and it's like, but sometimes it's hard for gay men to get past the penis or the size of the penis. And like you said, I wish they would look outside of that and see that we can make great lovers, great individuals, and add it to their scope of little box that they tend to want to live in. And it's hard. It's a challenging thing, but it's challenging either way, because going with a female, that also is challenging, because like, what do you mean you don't have a penis? Like, and you have to go through the whole story. So I believe that trans men have it a lot harder finding relationships, whether you're gay or straight, than a lot of the trans women, because there is like this thing with genetically born guys that are into trans women. It's like, call it a fetish, call it that curiosity, they're okay with it. The other is a little harder for us,
I think about this as essentially a discussion of how we sexualize bodies in the West. We sort of treat breasts and penises as sexual organs, as sort of active sexual organs, and trans men often have neither in the typical sense. And so we sort of end up with almost Ken doll bodies for many of us, because so many of the surgeries that we might want are either ineffectual or expensive and inaccessible for so many trans men. So our bodies get actively desexualized. People think you don't have anything, and that's I think that's a sort of scientifically based misogyny. We've decided to allow this misogyny to exist by saying that the organs that we do have and the things we do have can't be sexual, and that I just think that's kind of ridiculous.
Totally.
But that's the direction our culture has taken us with sexualizing bodies.
And I think it's changed a little bit. I want to thank Buck Angel because he's done a lot to create interest. Prior to him, it was like a trans who, what, and his porn has really opened up the appetite for some individuals, because I do get freaky little emails every now and then. Oh, I have this fantasy about being with you and all this and the other, but I'm like, I don't know if I want to be a fantasy. That's, I don't know. It's like, I want to be taken serious as an individual. I have feelings. I want to fall in love. I want somebody to fall in love with me, to respect me and honor my body as is, but it's one of those things.
You make a really interesting point there. We're just starting to become a commodity in that regard. And mentioning Buck Angel as well as James Darling with FTM Fucker and Chase Armstrong, they're all doing really useful sort of public service work for gay trans men. I get, gay men use lots of apps on the phone, etc., and I get tons of messages from people who are like, I've always been very curious. And you're right. The curiosity can feel good and also can feel bad, because it's not really about me. It's just about the body, and that makes it feel pretty fetishizing. But that also, I think, is one of the tricks of where we are in our visibility. We're just starting to come onto the radar for so many non-trans gay men, and it means that a taste essentially has to be developed for bodies like ours, and that takes time and exposure. And I certainly know that there are people who, before meeting me or other gay trans men, had no idea that they would be attracted to bodies like ours, and now it's something that they seek out because it's filled a niche that they didn't really even know was present in their desire. So
exactly. We talked about this in the post show a little bit about being in Thailand. But those that didn't watch the post show, how did you end up in Thailand, and how is life there for trans men? I know that a lot of trans women go there to get their surgeries, and they're very used to seeing trans females, but how is life there for trans men in general?
The surgical prowess is relevant to trans men here as well. They do have lots of surgeons here who do transmasculine surgeries. But what you see about Thailand is it's very, very good on the surgical front, but not so great on continuing care. And that's a particular issue for trans men because it means that lots of trans men don't get annual gynecological exams, don't get continuing care on blood work, and we have lots of increased risks with that our blood work could easily highlight if we were having continuing care. Not to mention that the Thai culture is not particularly fond of mental health care. So there's not a whole lot of mental health care associated with transition here either. They primarily work on an informed consent model, though they don't really call it that. Medicine is just very different than it is in the West here. And you're right, trans women and katoi, which are the sort of the category of within Thai culture, distinct from trans women, but still on that spectrum, are very, very visible here. Very visible in media here. Trans men are a good ways behind that in terms of visibility. And I know maybe 5 or 6 Thai trans guys, which is not very many, frankly. And they all are. Almost all of them are really early transition. They're all straight identified, and they're all dealing with what ends up being a pretty conservative culture at the end of the day. Gender roles are really quite conservative here, so the transition is certainly possible, but because of the way that gender roles seem to work, it's socially more difficult, if not medically so, than than I experienced in the U.S. I moved here long after easily passing, so this isn't something that really impacts me directly, but I see it impact Thai trans men in my interactions with them pretty regularly. Also in Thailand, they can't change birth certificates or identity documentation. You can't change your name or your gender marker. And so there's that causes issues at school and in work and in healthcare throughout trans folks' lives that really hasn't been mitigated here yet, unfortunately.
And you mentioned earlier they really don't do the psychological intervention. There's no gender specialist, so maybe that's one of the reasons they still have not moved forward with changing the gender marker and things of that nature. They probably don't get it. To them, it's just like a cosmetic type of thing. They really don't see it as this is more than just a fetish, maybe.
I'm not comfortable speculating on the why so much, but I do think there's a relationship between the absence of continuing care and psychological care and where the laws sit here. Absolutely. I definitely think there's a relationship. I'm just, which direction, what's causal is a bit beyond my expertise.
It's kind of dangerous too, because the psychological intervention is something that's very needed because, as much as people say, no, it's not psychological in nature, there is a lot of psychology that's needed for us because we're altering our bodies, changing our lives completely. And there's usually a lot of issues that stem from childhood because we weren't seen the way we want to be seen. And it just doesn't get fixed by changing the parts like Mr. Potato Head. There's a lot more involved. So,
and I think that doesn't stop at transition either for many people. One of the misconceptions about transition in general public is that it's as soon as you're done with the medical intervention, quote unquote done, the process is over or your life is perfect. And for a lot of people, we transition and then we're still kind of sad or still kind of unhappy and realize that transition was only one part of what we needed to fix. It was the biggest and most pressing, perhaps, but there's lots of other things that we need to deal with that once you get transition out of the way, then you can start to work on, or once you get sort of a bit more alignment between your identity and your presentation. And so I personally think the absence of psychological intervention options here is damaging, but it's also a cultural thing. It's not particularly prevalent for any psychological issues here for someone to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And so I feel uncomfortable passing judgment on it beyond saying that for me, had I not had psychological support throughout and since my transition began, I don't think I would be doing particularly well. So I'm grateful for having had it, and I would hope that eventually it becomes available to trans folks globally.
It's definitely needed because a lot of people do feel that once they've transitioned, life is like everything's great. And it's like, if your life wasn't great before you transition, do not think it's going to get any better. I mean, there's a part of it that might, but if you're an unhappy person, chances are you're going to be an unhappy person after transition as well, because that's how it works. Yeah. Which brings me to my next question. How do you feel trans regret is handled in and outside of our community?
Regret associated with transition, I think it's one of those things that we just don't really allow ourselves to talk about a lot because when we do, it gets used really actively as ammunition against us in larger conversation. And what that ends up making happen, unfortunately, is people make hasty decisions because no one has ever said, or so few people have said, I wish I had waited, or I wish I had done this differently. And so in the post you're referring to, I'm talking about hysterectomy, and I had my hysterectomy in 2004. And while I would not go back and have not done it then, I also kind of regret it now. Now that I identify as gay and I still want to be a parent, and the possibility of parenting is different now than it would have been pre-transition. I feel like that decision was perhaps a bit hasty for me, and so many of our conversations about medical intervention happen so early in the trans experience because we need to do medical intervention to be able to pass, and we need to do medical intervention to be able to align presentation with identity. But that ends up meaning that for many of us, we don't weigh all of the pros and cons of decisions, or later in life we might decide we want something different. And I guess the purpose of that post is to challenge us to talk about that more openly, at least with each other, because I think it would be really useful in deciding about surgeries and other medical interventions to be able to talk to people who aren't necessarily happy with the decisions that they made and might have made those decisions differently had they had different advice coming up. Just to make sure that we are making the right choices for us at the right times in our lives.
But unfortunately, like you said, a lot of times we badger each other when somebody tries to talk about trans regret. It's like the force of evil upon you, that type of thing. And it shouldn't be that way. I mean, there are people who actually transition and regret it. And that's okay. It's not for everybody. And that's okay for people to talk about it and for people to feel safe to be able to talk about it. Because it's one of those things. It's not always for everybody.
And I think that the thing we have to sort of decouple there is our fear of those folks' experience being used against everyone else.
Exactly.
We need to come up with other arguments against the non-supportive, non-trans people, against transphobic folks, about regret and about people who decide to transition back or detransition, because the arguments that this is a rare thing aren't actually particularly helpful arguments. What it ends up doing is making it so that we exacerbate regret issues because we don't talk about it openly. I would love to see us move more towards transition and trans identity is about finding your true self. And for many of us, that process means that we make false starts and we make wrong decisions along the way as we try to feel it out. And some people regret the decisions that they make or decide that it's not the right path. And that doesn't mean that the rest of the folks are also on the wrong path, that it's a very individual process. I'd like it to see us take a more sort of detransitioning and transitioning back positive tack on dealing with those transphobic regret-based arguments, because I think that we end up shooting ourselves in the foot when we just sort of shun people who decide to detransition or transition back, because we then make it so it's not possible for us to talk about regret in ways that would be constructive to people transitioning in the future.
Exactly. And we need to support one another and understand one another. No two people are alike, and people have different circumstances, and we have to respect that and honor one another. What would you like to see in the near future for the trans community worldwide?
Globally, I think the thing that I'd like to see the most is more active discussion of the variety of us that exist. Having lived in Asia for a year and a half now and gotten to meet tons and tons of wonderful trans folks over here, one of the things that I'm getting exposed to is just the variety of ways in which people can be and are trans, and how so much of the narrative around trans identity has been dictated by white middle-class Western trans folks, and as is most of the media, dictated by white middle and upper class folks. So I think it's really important that we start to talk about trans identities as global and historical. Many of the indigenous cultures in Southeast Asia have historical trans identities that are really important in their culture or religion or spirituality. And from Nats in Myanmar to Katoi in Thailand to Fafafafine in sort of in Pacific Islands. These things are present and were present long before sort of modernity in the West. And there's a misconception that this trans identity is something that Westerners invented, and that certainly isn't true. And it also means that trans folks in other parts of the world have their identities have to get folded into the Western definition, and that flattens the definition. It takes the history and the complexity out, and I'd like us to start really having informed historical global conversations about what these identities can and have meant and how they fit into local cultures.
Definitely. And like you said, we have a major history, and it didn't start off in Western culture. And it
didn't start with Christine Jorgensen. It's
exactly. It's been way, but the U.S., we think we're the center of the universe, which is, it's totally bizarre. Anything else you wanted to add before I bid you goodbye?
I guess the only other piece I'd like to throw in is about sort of the larger goal that I have in my work with thinking about trans folks as more complex people than just our transitions. For me, transition is integrated into everything about me and everything in my life, but that doesn't mean it's the only thing that I know about or can talk about, and it doesn't mean that it's the only vantage I can bring to a conversation. And this problem presents itself really vividly in sort of current Hollywood issues with trans folks being played by non-trans actors. There's in that an assumption that the trans experience can be distilled to just the transition, and that it's not sort of integrated into the people that we are and the lives that we live. And in doing that distillation, we